The vertebral column and the bones that are associated with it are actually pretty easy to name. You really just have three different regions with the total of 26 bones hanging out inside of it. The first region being the cervical vertebrae, or the cervical region, which, if you remember back a little ways, that region is called, the neck region is called the cervical region, so that should help a little bit. The thoracic vertebrae are pertaining to the thoracic region, with the lumbar region vertebrae pertaining to the lumbar region, or the abdominal region, and the sacrum and the coccus being a part of the abdominal pelvic region as well. Let's look at a couple of these bones really quick before we dive into it in great detail. In between each vertebrae, you're going to notice that there is an intervertebral disc. Now this disc is made of a fibrocartilage. If you're remembering back then, that is the strongest type of cartilage there is, while also giving it that strong matrix to support these bones. With the combination of the shape of the bones as well as that padding, that disc, you're going to get a curve in that spine. You're going to have that circle spine starting off nice and straight and flat to interact with that foramen magnum, and then it slowly bends out to match up with your scapula, to match up with that space that you need in that thoracic cavity, but then returning back to that center of mass in the region that has a lot of that weight-bearing activity, in the lumbar region. This portion is associated and directly attached via a joint, a fibrous joint, the sacrum, which just dissipates that weight into that sacrum, to that pelvic girdle, as well as into that femur. Now, every so often you can get that intervertebral disc accidentally gooing out and invading if it gets too much pressure, especially in that lumbar region. And if it goos out, it's called a herniated disc. Those of you that are familiar with hernias are just things that are organs or tissues that are hanging out in places they aren't supposed to be. They've snuck out of their region. In this case, that herniated disc has entered into the spinal column and is now pushing up against that spinal cord, which, if you pull on those nerves that it's attached to, it's going to be a very, very unpleasant, painful experience. So let's take a look at each one of these regions bit by bit. First off, we got the cervical curve, which has the cervical region, which has the 7 cervical vertebrae. The thoracic region has the 12 vertebrae, and the lumbar region has 5. What's great about this is, if you minus the cervical vertebrae, the number of cervical vertebrae by the number of the thoracic vertebrae by the number of cervical, you're going to get the number of lumbar, which is 5. The reverse is true as well. If you do thoracic minus lumbar, you're going to get the number of cervical. 12 minus 5 is 7. You could also add the cervical and lumbar vertebrae numbers, and you can also get 12. All that I'm telling you here is that it's just a little quick trick to help you remember the numbers in each region. I do want you to notice as well, in this picture before we move on, how much smaller that vertebral body is inside the cervical. But as you get progressively lower and lower in that spinal column, that vertebral column, these vertebral bodies, these things right here, get thicker and thicker to help support and deal with the more and more weight that's being added upon it. Just like the person being built if you're building a human pyramid, you want those really strong, really muscular individuals down at the bottom to help bear up the weight of all those individuals that are up above. In between that vertebral body and this lamina, this portion of the bone that's developed, and all of that encases this vertebral foramen, which allows for that spinal cord to sneak on through. In between each of these, basically nearby these discs, the spinal column is able to send out those spinal nerves to interact with and sense or send off a motor sensory, we'll talk about that next session, out into the body. On the back, is a very telltale sign of what type of vertebrae you may be looking at. Cervical vertebrae, that spinous process. Cervical vertebrae have a very unique shape on their spines. As we go through this, as we go to the next one, go down to the thoracic and go on down to the lumbar, you are going to notice something else. If you can get a hold of looking at different types of vertebrae, you'll be able to discern between them very easily as we get, if you were to compare them side by side. For now, let's go ahead and begin off with the cervical vertebrae, and let's look at all the distinct characteristics about that vertebrae type. Once again, remember that they are smaller. They are the smaller vertebrae of the spinal column, the vertebral column. And most of the time I need to point out right here, right now, that these vertebrae aren't named more than just C1, C2, C3, C4, etc., T4, T5, L1, L2, L3, except for two really super important ones. The very first two ones. C1 and C2 both have names to them. C1 is named Atlas. If you remember back in Greek mythology, what Atlas is doing is he's holding up the entire world. Same here with us. Atlas is holding up our skull, which contains our entire world. We lose our brain, we lose us. So Atlas is holding up our world. Underneath Atlas, you always wondered how the world spins if Atlas is holding on to the world. But underneath Atlas, you have the axis, which allows for a little bit more turning. Now, let's look at the differences between the C1, C2, and the rest of the vertebrae. Here's C1 in the upper left corner here. C1, you're going to notice it doesn't have that spinous process. Here's a normal one. It has that like bifurcated tongue almost type of thing. I call it a snake bone almost because it has that bifurcated tongue or that split tongue. Atlas doesn't have that. What it does have is it's a nice wide opening. And it also, it's a little bit, almost a little bit more delicate in appearance almost. This one down here is C2, our axis. You'll see that one really prominent, important piece about this cervical vertebrae is that it has this thing called a dens. This dens sort of limits how much you turn that atlas. Of course, the other vertebrae in the neck have some give to allow for your head to turn, but that axis is also there acting to help mitigate and allow for that nice turning process. Now let's talk about the general characteristics of a cervical vertebrae. First off, you're going to notice something in I shouldn't say normal because all these are normal. In thoracic and lumbar vertebrae, you're only going to see this one hole. In cervical vertebrae, you're going to see 1, 2, 3 holes. What's going on here, you have blood going in and out of the brain via these holes. The blood vessels are going through these holes, a set of blood vessels. There's a couple that's going up to the head, but a good portion of it that's heading up to the brain is going through these holes. And they're called transverse foramen, while the larger one is called the vertebral foramen. Now let's go ahead and give it a comparison against the thoracic vertebrae. If you look at the side of that cervical vertebrae, you can see the spinous process. It's kind of sticking out. It's nice and thin, and it also has that snake-like tongue to it. But here, you don't really see that division going on. It's a nice single tongue. One student in the past actually described it as looking like a giraffe, which I kind of can see. There's the ears of the giraffe. There's its long nose, long mouth, and there's the horns of the giraffe. You're also going to notice that it doesn't really have those holes off to the side like the cervicals did. Remember that the thoracic and the lumbar don't have those transverse foramen. You are going to notice one other thing about the thoracic foramen is that it does have a receiving spot for your ribs that don't exist in other parts of the body or other parts of the spinal cord. You can see this tubercle, the facet or articular portion of that, the spine receives the tubercle of that rib. So basically the backside of that giraffe ear is receiving that rib. That's some strong ears. Let's go down to the lumbar region. Obviously, these are the largest and strongest vertebrae of the entire body. They're also the ones that are most likely to get broken. So there is that. You will notice that again, it does have that vertebral space, so that there's your spinal cord going in right here with the spinal nerves projecting out. One thing to notice about this, again, it doesn't have the bifurcated tongue that you would see in the cervical column or cervical portion of the vertebral column. But you do notice that its nose gets really, really big in comparison. Very, very big in comparison to that of the thoracic region. It gets nice and wide, while these ones are pointing down and thin. These are nice and wide. When you get a chance, if you can look at the lumbar vertebrae, it kind of looks like the beginning of a moose face. Nice broad nose. There's its forward antlers a little bit, and then there's those big ears. You will notice that it doesn't have that facet or that articular surface to receive that rib as well. That's only in the thoracic region. There's the side-by-side comparison. Remember that cervicals are indeed the smallest. They're part of your neck. You got the 3 holes here. It does have that bifurcated tongue or that split tongue that a snake would have. You also have here the thoracic vertebrae. It has a nice thin projection. It has those articular surfaces on its transverse vertebrae to go ahead and receive that rib. It's a medium size, but on the lumbar you get the very, very large vertebral body going on here. It is the strongest bone. It's nice, wide, and thick to deal with the pressures that it's going to see. Let's go ahead and finish off the spinal cord bones that we were talking about. We're going to talk about the sacrum and the coccyx. Sacrum, remember, is this nice broad thing. What it used to be was several bones, kind of like the vertebrae that were here, but they have fused together. And these transverse lines are indicative of that, or they point to that was at one time that way. But they have indeed fused together. The coccyx, however, haven't fused yet. So you got a coccyx 1, 2, 3, and 4. Something about the sacrum is, again, we don't include the pelvis here because the pelvis is considered like your hip bones, I'm going to call them for now, aren't included in the axial skeleton because it's considered part of the appendicular skeleton and interacts with that femur really nicely. But they do insert or mend together, not quite mend, and not quite fuse either, but there is a very unique joint there that allows for just a tiny bit of give between the pelvic bones and the sacrum. We do need to discuss, we talked about normal curvature now, we've talked about the different types of linings, we've talked about the different types of vertebrae. Let's talk about what happens if something goes awry with them. Your posture's bad, or your genetics aren't favoring you right now, or maybe just a bad go at life, some traumatic issue. So these are the 3 postures that can occur or often occur that are irregular. You got scoliosis here, which is an S curve going on in the spine, so it's curving off to the left to give it that S appearance. So S for scoliosis is how I remember it. Lordosis, you got that lower portion of your spine is pushed in a little bit too much, and it gives you that lordly appearance, that nice, tall, strong, this is my domain, how dare you question me position. While kyphosis is extra indentation or extra bending in that thoracic region, which makes you look a little bit more humble and bent over a little bit, maybe just a tiny bit of a hump back. So kyphosis is that looking down. One last one to talk about is the spina bifida. You may remember that some of those bones, the portion of those vertebral column is really looking thin and delicate. Well, let's say mama hasn't been doing very well at not smoking or not drinking alcohol. Well, those bones and the signals behind the formation of the bones can be muted or lost, which can cause that vertebral column not to be developed appropriately, which will allow spinal fluid to leak into a port or leak out and underneath the skin. And as it's leaking out, you can also have a lot of that spinal cord and some of the nerves coming off of it leak into and become incorporated into this I'm going to call it this bulbous structure here, which is really, really detrimental if it's not taken care of quickly. With that, that is the end of our discussion of the spinal cord. We will be finishing off this chapter, chapter 7, with a discussion on the ribs, the sternum, and that will be it.